be talking about is kind of the crossover between those two worlds, water quantity and water quality. So let me start with the agenda here so we're all on the same page. What we're going to cover today is a brief introduction to the topic, this idea of kind of bridging the gap between water quantity and water quality law or policy in the U.S. So we're going to do a little bit of introduction and background into what that split has been based on historically, what some of the holes in the wall between water quantity and water quality might be. Just a very general introduction. I'm not going to do a legal brief here on the issue of water quantity and water quality law, but I'm going to make sure we all have kind of a basic background. And then we're going to talk about three pieces of the Clean Water Act that we, through our research, have found might be the best tools for starting to address low-flow kind of concerns under the Clean Water Act, places where there's some pretty direct kind of policy tools that groups and state agencies are using and or could be using a lot more robustly in order to address some of the flow issues that we really see in our rivers around the country. And those three areas are water quality standards, 401 water quality certification, and impaired waters, or the total maximum daily loads program. So those aren't the only three programs that we could address today by any means, but you'll see it's going to be more than enough to take up our time. And through a review that we did that resulted in this paper I mentioned at the beginning of the session, these are the tools that we really saw as most immediate and most practical in terms of application by watershed groups, river groups, or state agencies in the near term. So that's why we're going to focus there today. And then we're going to end with, if we have time, a little bit of discussion, which is always hard to get going on these webinars, but hopefully we'll have time and interest in that. But more importantly, perhaps with some resources, some places you can go to learn more about the things we talk about today. So with that, that's our agenda for the day. I'm going to start, though, with a disclaimer. That's a silver bullet. And the line through it means I am not going to be claiming today that I have found some magic silver bullet that perfectly bridges the chasm between water quantity law and water quality law. There really are some separations that are going to be a challenge to work with. So I don't want anybody to come to this webinar with the thought that, I've miraculously stumbled across some incredible legal argument that no other brilliant attorney has ever thought of. That is not the case. What we're going to be talking about today is some ideas on the legal front, some concepts that have been floating out there for quite a while and that we've simply kind of pulled together and synthesized for advocates, and some creative on-the-ground examples of things that are being tried in the states, again, by watershed groups, by state agencies, by others, that bridge that supposed chasm. So just to set expectations, low, I guess that's always smart, or at least not as high as the silver bullet idea. Just know that that's what we're going to be talking about today, is kind of some practical, straightforward ideas, not the silver bullet kind of magic that some of us might wish exist out there. So with that, let's just dive in here to the introduction. This is going to be basic for some of you, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. There really has been for a long time a perception that water quality, how clean the water is fundamentally different than water quantity, how much water we have and the timing of that water, et cetera, in terms of the law. The domains of the law have been quite separate. So as background, if we think about how water quality is regulated, that is addressed under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act provides what's fundamentally a federal approach to protecting and restoring water quality. Much of the day-to-day work of the Clean Water Act is delegated to the states to do. So a lot of the nuts and bolts really do get decided in 50 states and the territories all around the country, as well as in some tribal areas. But the national structure is set up in order to provide some degree of consistency across state boundaries, and federal oversight of those Clean Water Act programs is designed to, again, preserve some consistency. So agencies such as the U.S. EPA, and in the case of 404 wetlands permits, the Army Corps of Engineers, they provide an oversight function that keeps states accountable and consistent in terms of the national vision for clean water, for water quality. On the flip side, water quantity law has been largely left to the states to regulate, either under the riparian doctrine or the prior appropriations doctrine. For background, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, this is a gross oversimplification, but the riparian doctrine basically allows landowners that have a stream or other water body on their land to make reasonable use of the water, as long as that use does not interfere with other users' reasonable use, so downstream, etc. The prior appropriations doctrine, on the other hand, relies on several basic ideas, the most fundamental of which is that the first users of the water have the first right to that use. It's often summarized as first in time, first in right. And that users must make what's called beneficial use of that water in order to preserve their place in that line, the order of right to use. As a gross generalization again, riparian doctrine generally applies in the East, where it's a little wetter, while prior appropriations largely covers the more arid West. So that's if you're new to this idea of the separation between the two, there's your 101 primer. So these have long been seen as quite separate areas of law. Of course, the reality that anybody who works with rivers or even just goes out and fishes, understands is that everybody needs both plentiful and clean water. Whether you're a person, a fish, agricultural user, it matters to you if that water is clean enough for you or for your fish, and it matters if there's enough water. If you can't swim in it, that there's a problem. And whether you can't swim in it because there's no water or because that water is polluted, you still know you have a problem. So the reality is quite different than the way the law has been set up. So why is there this separation? There's a lot of reasons, and again, I'm not going to do kind of a full legal primer here. The paper that you'll get goes into a little more detail on this. But the Clean Water Act, when Congress tackled the idea of a national vision for clean water, did in fact address quantity in several different ways, and some of the ways in which it was addressed are what most folks who would like to preserve the wall between quality and quantity usually point to. There's two places that they usually point to in the Act. The first is shown here. And what this says, I guess I'll read it. It just basically says that the authority of each state to allocate quantities of water shall not be superseded, etc., by the Clean Water Act. So it's preserving this historic right that the states had to establish allocation systems and make those decisions themselves. So that's one place that folks often point to for this wall between the Clean Water Act and water quantity. The other is a later section of the Act, 510.2. And again, it just kind of reiterates that this Clean Water Act should not be read to impair the rights of the states to control water quantity decisions within the states. So these two sections are what most often are pointed to in terms of saying the Clean Water Act is not allowed to address flow. I'm going to argue here that these are not absolutes, and it's not going to be just me arguing them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court interprets these sections of the Act. So with that, to acknowledge what you'll often hear from folks, that this is the argument you'll often hear, and these are the places they're drawing those arguments from, which do exist. They are real. But I would argue, and many others, much smarter people than I, have argued that these are not absolutes, that wall that people think of is not a brick wall, and in fact has many holes in it. There's lots of places where you can see through what is often kind of attempted to be presented as a solid wall is really quite permeable. So again, I'm not going to go into an extensive legal analysis, but I thought what I'd show you here today is just some language from what's probably the most often quoted document addressing this water quality and water quantity kind of separation and just how hard and fast the wall actually is. That document is something we'll talk about more later in the presentation. What this is a Supreme Court decision. It's called PUD number 1. You'll often hear it referred to, which addresses 401 water quality certification, but very specifically was addressing some flow issues that were addressed through water quality certification. And you can see here that Justice O'Connor, writing for the majority, is very clear here. She just flat out says that the separation between quality and quantity is an artificial distinction. So that's pretty strong language, pretty clear. And this opinion was met with some awe in water policy circles. Despite how obvious it might seem to you or me or the fish that this is an artificial distinction, as a matter of law, it had been held as just kind of obvious that these two things are very separate. I didn't put the whole quote up here. You'll see the whole quote in the paper when I send it around, but she does go on to talk about how water quantity and water quality interact and why it's an artificial distinction, and says, at the end of the quote, in any event, there is a recognition in the act itself that reduced stream flow, i.e. a diminishment of water quantity, can constitute water pollution. So clearly the Supreme Court is not seeing that wall as quite as hard and fast as is sometimes claimed. This is more quotes from the PUD number 1 from Justice O'Connor. And again, here she's addressing the very sections that I just showed you that folks most often point to for the establishment of this wall between quantity and quantity. And what she's basically saying here is those two sections preserve the right of the state to allocate water quantity between users. That yes, states have the right to establish those systems, the water rights systems that it looks like many of you are very familiar with, but those same sections do not limit the kind of controls that could be imposed on, say, a water rights holder that has a water allocation through that state system. That the line there is about protecting the rights of the states to allocate their own water. It's not saying you can't require anything of those water right holders. And similarly, she went on to talk about the fact that the Clean Water Act could affect individual rights. That the purpose of the sections that are often quoted is not to prohibit those incidental effects. Again, it's instead to preserve the rights of the states to regulate water quantity, to not have the federal government establishing those systems. So this is like I say, probably the most quoted and relatively recent kind of statement that you'll see out there on this intersection between the Clean Water Act and water quantity, and it's really pretty fundamental. I think it makes a lot of good arguments for bridging that chasm that we maybe have accepted as too true for too long, and at least starting to look at the ways that there should be interaction between the water quantity regulation system and the water quality regulation system. And again, a lot of people have investigated where those holes are and started to use them, and those are the kind of things we're going to talk about today. So that's your very brief kind of background on this, the separation, the perceived separation between quantity and quality, and some of the ways in which that separation has been questioned over time and pretty fundamentally questioned by the Supreme Court. With that, I'd like to do one more kind of introductory slide here to make sure that those of you who are maybe a little newer to the Clean Water Act have some fundamental background on the Act itself. So the Clean Water Act, again, is a national approach to our water quality regulation, establishes a national vision and programs for that protection, but much of the day-to-day work is delegated to the states with continuing federal oversight. So as we discuss things today, you'll hear a lot of talk about the roles of states because they are really the front line. But remember that this is, a consistent national approach is the idea. What I have presented here is the Clean Water Act's overall objective, which is really lofty. The emphasis is added, though. I added it because especially when we're talking about flow, it's important to keep in mind that the Clean Water Act is not simply about chemical water pollution. We often think of it that way. In the 70s, in the early days of the Act, there were some pretty egregious chemical pollution things going on that made that the primary focus. Those are still a problem, but we have made great progress on the chemical side of things. The physical and biological integrity is kind of a newer arena, and flow definitely fits in there. So as we talk about flow, this is really how a lot of what we'll talk about today ties back to the overall big picture vision of the Act, is that it's not just about the chemical, but the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Act. So with that as background, a little reminder here, we're going to focus on just 3 of the Clean Water Act's core programs here. There's many more, but we're going to talk about water quality standards, 401 water quality certification, and impaired waters, or the 303D program, in our discussion today. But just a reminder that there's a lot more we could be talking about. Those are just the core we're going to start with. So with that, let's dive into the first of these topics. Won't spend too much time here because it looks like the majority of you are relatively familiar with water quality standards. But for those of you who are newer, it's important to keep in mind water quality standards have 3 core pieces in the Clean Water Act vision. These pieces are designated uses, water quality criteria, and an anti-degradation policy. In shorthand, designated uses simply identify the use or uses, in most cases, that we want to make of a particular river, stream, wetland, lake, or part of a stream, wetland, lake, etc. Could be a segment that we want to make. And by we, I mean the big we. It could be aquatic wildlife. It might be what the fish need in terms of a designated use, or it might be human use. So those uses are assigned to your water bodies in your water quality standards, and there's a few examples here. Cold water fishery versus a warm water fishery maybe. Swimming, you see a lot of recreational uses. Can also be things like irrigation. Cannot be things like waste disposal or transport. Those are specifically barred as designated uses under the Clean Water Act. So it's again uses that people want to make, but it has to tie back to the overall vision of the Clean Water Act, which is, in part, there's a goal in the Clean Water Act of fishable, swimmable waters is the shorthand for one of the goals. So those uses need to be established to achieve that goal. Associated with designated uses is water quality criteria. So for each of those uses, there's a set of associated criteria that need to be met in order to protect the use. So the example here is a minimum amount of dissolved oxygen that you might want at any time if you wanted to protect a cold water fisheries. Other examples might be a maximum amount of a pollutant. For example, in the swimming scenario, there might be a maximum amount of bacteria. Or there's ranges. For example, a pH is expressed as a range. So water quality criteria are the kind of goals that are associated with those designated use for specific water quality needs. It's important to note, we'll see here that there are numeric water quality criteria, like the examples I've given you. There are also narrative water quality criteria. Those criteria usually describe desirable conditions. So that might be, in Utah, we have a free from scum and floating debris narrative standard. A lot of states have some version of that. So it's not about a particular pollutant necessarily, but it allows you to get at some problems that you might see in your waters. So those are the 2 core pieces that are tied together. The anti-degradation policy is a slightly different beast. We're going to only be able to touch on anti-degradation today. We've done several webinars on anti-degradation. If you're curious, I'd suggest you go check those out in recordings or our online course, cleanwateract.org. But at its simplest incarnation, anti-degradation establishes in your state water quality standards 3 levels of protection. The first is simply protection of existing water quality and uses. The idea here is that we shouldn't be allowing activities that we know will remove a designated use. So the state, for example, should not issue a permit that they know will wipe out a cold water fishery or make it unsafe to swim in a local swimming hole. That's Tier 1 protection, it's often called, protecting existing uses. Tier 2 protections are for cases where you have better quality water. Maybe it's better for a particular parameter than just barely meeting the water quality criteria, in which case it's the anti-degradation policies say we want to protect that higher quality water. That's a valuable resource. But the Tier 2 protections do allow for degradation of that high-quality water, but only if several tests are met. The most fundamental are that the applicant has to prove there's no no feasible alternative to degrading the water quality, and that there's important local economic or social development benefits to allowing the degradation. as well as they need to prove that there are protections in place, that there's no other big problems in the water body in terms of point or non-point source pollution. So that's Tier 2. It's basically protecting water quality, except in certain circumstances where the degradation is allowable because there's no alternatives and it's important for social and economic development. Tier 3 protection just basically says there's some places that are so outstanding we're going to allow no degradation. And those are places that are important recreationally or ecologically that states assign just a pure protection to, no degradation at all. And that is called Tier 3, sometimes outstanding national resource waters protection. So there's your basic overview of standards. With that, I want to talk a little bit about how standards can relate to flow. We've got six ideas here I want to put on the table. Since there's 6, you know we're going to move through them pretty quickly. Again, the paper that you'll receive goes into each of these in a little more detail. Today, we'll just touch on them to get your thoughts flowing. So the first one here to talk about is designated uses. I'm just going to talk about this fairly quickly. It's intuitive that designated uses that are assigned to, say, a river will often intuitively require flow. For example, if it's a swimming area, you're not going to be able to swim if there's no water. And similarly, a lot of aquatic life uses require flow to be considered. Again, if there's no water, you're clearly not supporting, say, trout. But it may also be timing, peak flows. There's lots of different requirements that might come into play. So designated uses, intuitively require flow to be addressed. But the thing about designated uses in all of the water quality standards topics we'll talk about today is, although it's intuitive, designated uses are not self-implementing. So what we'll talk about is tools such as 401 water quality certification, we're going to talk about later, that can be kind of the implementer for the fact that designated uses require flow. But it's worth thinking about designated uses in the flow context, because if you don't have the right designated uses in place, you're going to have a really hard time using other tools to protect or restore flows. So this next slide here talks about the fact that there's 2 basic things to think about. I'm focused on aquatic life use here because I focus on habitat. The same things could apply to recreational uses or other uses. If you're thinking about flow and your designated uses, you need to think about 2 things. You need those uses to be specific enough that you could actually use those uses to set up flow requirements that would protect the uses. So for example, if your designated use is simply aquatic life, just generically, any kind of fish, macroinvertebrates, etc., it might be hard at times to make a compelling case using these other tools we'll talk about to have a specific minimum flow or a specific timing of flow that a certain species needs in order to, say, spawn properly or that kind of thing. So making sure that you have good, specific designated uses in place is one important factor in connecting designated uses with flows. The other, of course, is just to make sure that the appropriate uses are assigned to the appropriate places, so the right water bodies or segments of water bodies. Again, if you're working at a watershed level and you look at your designated uses, you may find that you have good specific uses, but the spawning areas are not actually protected for spawning of the species you're concerned about, and you'll need to get the right designated uses in place. So just fundamentally, something to think about. These uses underlie everything else we'll talk about today, and if they're not the right designated uses, you're going to have a hard time using any of the other tools to protect or restore flows. So the next and most obvious water quality standards connection to flow issues is in-stream flow criteria. Use the little raise hand function if you know that your state has in-stream flow water quality criteria. Let's see if anybody has them. I've got at least one. Okay, a couple. Okay. Oh, that's not so bad. Oh, it's funny. It went up and then it went down. Looks like we have about 3 folks, and I don't know what states they're from. So I don't know if they're from, actually I know at least two of them are from different states. Uh, In-stream flow criteria do exist. This is one of the places where obviously the wall between quantity and quality has been chipped away at. And these in-stream flow criteria are often narrative descriptions of flow requirements. I have not seen the explicit numeric expressions, although there are some states with minimum in-stream flow requirements, particularly on specific rivers. But you do see in-stream flow criteria, relatively rare, particularly rare, I would say non-existent in the prior appropriation states. So they're out there, but they're rare. And if you look at the chat, you can see that folks have shared Washington State, Connecticut, and New York do. There's several examples. April's from Georgia. There's several examples where these criteria do in fact exist, and this is the clearest connection you could possibly make. If you have these criteria in place, you're making a direct bridge from the water quantity world to the water quality world and back clearly. So here's a few examples that I don't think either of these came up in the chat. This is Tennessee and Kentucky. You'll see they're very general narrative statements, which can be a weakness. Hard to translate this into a particular action or activity, a particular permit situation. On the other hand, they give you a lot of room to work. These aren't just a minimum flow. They could be used to argue for peak flows, timing of flows, etc. So something to keep in mind is that these do exist. In fact, Region 4 has put all of their states on notice that they are expecting the states to address in-stream flow criteria in their next review of water quality standards. It's called the Triennial Review of Standards. So at least one region of US EPA is really kind of nudging this idea forward, harder in different parts of the country. So that's the most obvious bridge that you can build in water quality standards. But there's some others that are less obvious, but fruitful areas for consideration. One that you hear a lot about these days is biocriteria. These criteria exist in a lot of states, are under development in a lot of the others, and biocriteria basically try to identify what a healthy reference aquatic ecosystem looks like, usually focused on macroinvertebrates, the little critters in the stream. And use that as a criteria, as something to measure streams against to see how healthy is this aquatic ecosystem. So it's a relatively direct measure of the health of a system. Again, usually focused on macroinvertebrates. Some states also have kind of index or descriptions for fish or aquatic plants. But you'll see these often focused on macroinvertebrates. These don't directly address in-stream flow, but clearly flow is one of the factors that's going to be influencing the type of systems you see and then the health of those systems all around the state. Here's an example of a biocriterion from kind of my neck of the woods from New Mexico. And you can see here, I won't read the whole thing off, but it talks about comparing to a natural or minimally impacted stream or water body in the region. And part of that would be flow. Clearly, for example, naturally you're going to have some variation, what you might find in an intermittent stream versus a perennial stream, historically intermittent or historically perennial, would vary in terms of the macroinvertebrate community. So you might have different reference streams for different types of systems. But then even within those, if you change the flows, you're going to see a change in the aquatic community. So when you see, say, a community that's identified as impaired, using the biocriteria as the measuring stick, flow may be one of the issues that you can really get at through that identification of impairment. So that's biocriteria. If it's not already in your world, it's coming to your world soon. And it's worth looking at how your state has established those and what you might be able to do with biocriteria in terms of identifying flow problems and then looking for restoration opportunities. An even newer area is the idea of physical water quality criteria. If you remember the Act, the objective of the Act is to protect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity. The physical world has got a lot less attention over the years than either the chemical or the biological. There's some exceptions to that. Temperature is a physical parameter. It's very widespread. quite a few states have stream bottom deposits as a criterion. But the actual, say, structure of the stream channel itself or the habitat structure is something that not many states have established actual criteria for. Arizona is an example of a state. In fact, the only example that I've found, people can use the chat to tell me others, please, if you know of them, where those types of issues are being considered. And Arizona is still in very initial stages, but they're looking at using things like the Roskin kind of approach to get at channel shape and stability. This is clearly tied to flow. Flows, shape the channel, for example. Bank stabilization, clearly related to flows. Again, not only related to flows, but physical criteria, where they're developed and implemented in the future, could be a really great direct connection to flow concerns. So something to maybe at least start talking to your state about, because it's not on the front burner in most states, and talk to them about what it would mean, what it would address, and how you might be thinking about flow in that context. So somebody just posted, it's Streamflow standards, Connecticut Streamflow standards link to chat. I was thinking it was physical, but that's handy. That's really good to see. I meant to mention in the in-stream flow criteria section that Vermont also has some fairly extensive narrative language about in-stream flow criteria. So that would be another interesting place to look if you're curious. It looks like Connecticut would be another place to look. So those are some of the more, maybe you could argue cutting edge kind of areas. By that I mean the in-stream flow criteria, the biocriteria, and physical criteria ideas. But if your state's maybe a little behind, you don't have any of those, or you're not getting enough traction with those, that's by no means all you have to work with. Lots of the traditional parameters, a lot of the traditional pollutants that we all work with may be related to flow or in some cases habitat concerns. Can anybody chat a more traditional pollutant that is often related to, say, a low flow kind of concern? I'll put some up there, but let's see if we can get some people to share. Temperature, Melinda says. Mitchell says DO. You guys are fast. Good typists. Temperature, DO. Temp came up again. Sediment. Okay. All right. You guys get the idea. And you've anticipated the three. I think those are the three leading most obvious. And also, incidentally, very common problems. You see a lot of 303D listings, impaired waters listings for these kinds of issues. We'll also see, though, that a lot of our parameters, if you think about what's going on in a stream, a lot of our water quality criteria are established for concentrations of a pollutant. And if you have more flow, you have a lower concentration. So we'll look at some examples where states have been playing with that idea a little bit. So it doesn't have to just be these things that are pretty obvious. Melinda just mentioned nutrients too, algal mats. Yeah, nutrients are one that I'm seeing more and more connected to flow for certain, which then ties into dissolved oxygen, et cetera. But if you really start to think about how particularly rivers work, flow can come up in a lot of situations. These are just perhaps the most obvious. Another one that comes up a lot out here is total dissolved solids. So with that, don't think too narrowly about how your water quality criteria may relate to flow and how you might be able to insert flow into the discussion in your local watershed. So before we leave standards, I want to at least touch on anti-degradation in flow. This is an area where there has not been a lot of activity in terms of pushing the envelope, but I do have an example I'll show you. As a reminder, there's three basic tiers of protection, and in terms of flow, this is grossly oversimplified, but you can think of tier one as saying, you can't remove an existing use. So arguably, dewatering a stream or, changing the flows in such a way that you cannot support, say, the fishery or the recreational use, is removing a use. So that would be a tier one situation. Tier two could be about whether to allow a reduction in flows, and that's the example I'm going to show you. So I'll explain that more in a second. And tier three, arguably, these outstanding national resource waters or state resource waters. Arguably, if you're not allowing water quality degradation, that would usually mean not allowing water quantity degradation. You can't be, harming the use and or concentrating the pollutants in lower flows. I've never seen that actually play out. So if anybody has an example of stopping or changing a water quantity issue as it relates to Tier 3 protections, I'd be really interested to hear it. But my example actually has to do with the Tier 2 protection, these kind of higher quality water situations. And it comes from Tennessee. So Tennessee, they apply anti-degradation to different permits that come up in the state. And one of those is water withdrawal applications. And where they have higher quality water, they're applying the Tier 2 concepts. And if you remember, Tier 2 says we're not going to allow degradation if we can avoid it because we think that higher water quality is valuable, and it establishes several tests that you have to go through to prove that you do need to degrade the water quality. The two that you hear about most often, again, are you have to prove there's no alternatives, no feasible alternatives, and that it's important to local economic and social development to allow that degradation to occur. So as the state agency staff described to me, this lets them look at these applications and ask the question of whether to allow the withdrawal, not just how. So this isn't an example the state government gave me, but just to give you a dramatic hypothetical, withdrawing water for a local community that maybe has a well that's gone bad, so they need a new water supply, you might easily be able to show that there's no alternatives. Perhaps you've got a pollution problem in your groundwater that's caused that problem at the other well. You need to do a withdrawal from a river. So perhaps you go through and you show that there's not any feasible alternatives to this surface water withdrawal. And you can show it's important for local social development because otherwise, people are going to be, having to buy water, et cetera. On the flip side, if a bottling company wanted to come in and withdraw a bunch of water and all the money was going to go to fat cats in New York City as opposed to there in Tennessee, all the profits, that might not be able to pass the tests of, are there alternatives and does it support important local economic and social development? So this is an interesting example from Tennessee. I haven't seen this applied broadly throughout the country. Again, if you have examples, I'd love to hear them. But it definitely applies. Anti-degradation is part of the standards. So it'd be really a place to explore in your state in terms of connecting flow, these kind of activities that involve water withdrawals, dams, et cetera. So with that, though, let's talk about a little bit about strengths and weaknesses when you think about water quality standards and flow. The strengths, are that this is very direct connection to the conditions on the ground. Some of the tools we'll talk about later really rely on strong water quality standards in order to work. Anti-degradation particularly can be really powerful for protection as opposed to restoration. And we'll see that that's kind of a rare idea in some of the tools we're going to talk about. A lot of the focus will be more on restoration. Particularly where you can tie flow to traditional parameters like dissolved oxygen and sediment and temperature, it may be a fairly direct, easy connection to make using other tools. Weaknesses are none of these are self-implementing. Like I talked about with designated uses, anti-degradation, the use of those water quality criteria really require a mechanism in order to be applied, whether that's a permitting situation, a 401 certification kind of situation like we'll talk about next, a total maximum daily load. These are the water quality standards are the basis of every other tool we talk about, so they're very important, but they're not a standalone tool in most cases. Also, new criteria, so for example, in-stream flow criteria, creating and establishing those can be technically and politically taxing, whether you're a watershed group advocating for those new criteria or a state agency struggling with developing them. So it's easy to say all the states should have in-stream flow criteria. It's really a strategic decision to say, how far and how quickly you push those ideas out there. So we need to acknowledge that it can require a lot of work to get these tools in place. So with that, I think we have our first question slide. I've been talking for a long time. So does anybody have any questions you want to chat? Or if you're on the phone, you can hit *6 and unmute yourself and ask them verbally. Wait a second here and see if anything pops up. Either I've stunned you into submission or I've been very thorough because I'm not seeing anything. Maybe I'll move on, but if questions come up, feel free to pipe in at any point. So let's move on to the next little section here. The next tool I wanted to talk about is 401 Water Quality Certification. This is my new obsession in life, so bear with me here a little bit. My first slide is going to be really text-heavy. I'm going to try to break it apart a little bit for you. Oh, wait, I got a comment here. Melinda says, I'd mentioned that 2018 would get rid of some of the protections of the federal structure of law that you noted earlier. Oh, I believe that Melinda's referencing, I'm not so familiar with the bill.
Merritt, that's
the new.
That's the MICA bill that just passed the House committee last week.
Right.
So you would lose a lot of the federal floor
right.
if that bill were to go through.
Thanks, Melinda. I knew about the bill. I haven't got the number in my head yet, I guess. I was thinking that you were doing 208. But yes, there are threats to all of the things we'll talk about today in Congress, particularly with the MICA bill, which looks like it's 2018, that really is getting at the fundamental structure of the Clean Water Act and the kind of the balance of power between the federal oversight and the state implementation. It's a really troubling bill. Probably Clean Water Network would be the place to get involved if people would like to learn more about that and get involved in those discussions. Thanks, Melinda. That's a very good point to make for people. So getting back to 401 certification, this is my most text-heavy slide. I'll try not to punish you too much with these. But the Clean Water Act includes a section 401 that addresses the balance of power between the federal government and the state government in a different way. What 401 basically does is give states the authority to review and condition federal activities that require a license or permit. So to break down this snippet from that section, this section requires as kind of a trigger that there's a federal license or permit that the state can review. So there's a lot of activities that the feds do. Examples might include 404 wetland discharge permits, wetland dredge and fill permits under the Army Corps of Engineers. They're a federal agency issuing a permit. The state under 401 can review those permits. Similarly, in states where US EPA issues the discharge permits, the NIPDES permits under the Clean Water Act, the states can use this authority. Things like we just saw a case where a special use permit that the Forest Service issued for a dam and diversion on their land requires 401 water quality certification from the state. It just needs to be a federal license or permit for an activity that may result in a discharge into navigable waters. So it's not just every single permitted activity that the federal government undertakes. There has to be a potential for a discharge. And the navigable waters piece is important for those of you who are familiar with the ongoing debate about which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act. It can be very important in this context, but I'm not going to go into details here, except to say that there's a guidance out for comment right now that it's really important to make sure that we include the waters that need to be protected in the Clean Water Act world, including for the 401 water quality certification section. So you have to have the potential for a discharge. And then it says what the states can do is review those proposed licenses or permits to make sure that they comply with the sections of the Act. There's a long list of sections here. The one you'll hear most often is 303 is the water quality standards and Tmdl kind of area. And so states often are really looking to see, will this proposed activity comply with their water quality standards? So this is like kind of a check and balance approach that the states have, a power that the states have over federal activities. And it's kind of impressive the options the state has in this check and balance situation. So the state has 4 options. They can certify the project. They can basically say, we've reviewed this, it's going to comply with our water quality standards and other portions of the law. So we certify, yep, you can go ahead with it as envisioned. The state can say, no, we're going to certify this project, but we're going to put some conditions on it that are necessary to comply with our water quality standards or, again, other appropriate law. So these conditions can be very wide-ranging and can and have addressed situations involving flow. And we'll look at an example. So these conditions, once the state decides they need to be in place, they're not optional. The federal agency has to incorporate them into their final license or permit, or else they can't move forward. So the state has kind of the final say. Yep, you can move forward, but only if you do X, Y, or Z. And these can be, again, quite specific. They can be general housekeeping and monitoring requirements, all the way up to very explicit requirements about, say, minimum midstream flows or best management practices. Lots of different kind of conditions that are put in place, as long as they're related to protecting, water quality. Can't be, you need to build the state agency staff a hot tub, and then we'll let you move forward. It has to tie to the situation and water quality. The third option the state has, though, is to just outright deny certification. Say, nope, there's no way that this license can move forward and still protect, water quality standards and the other things that we have in place. And if the state does that, the federal agency cannot issue the permit as written. So very dramatic power there on the state side. Or the state can just waive this authority. There's certain time clocks that are in place that if the state doesn't take action, it's considered waived and the activity just gets to move forward as permitted. So those are the very basics of what the state can do. And again, these conditions in the 401 situation have addressed flow. And more fundamentally, even outside of the flow context, this is really exciting to me because the 401 certification is a rare chance to kind of fundamentally change the way in which an activity is conducted or stop it altogether. A lot of the tools we talk about are process. This can really make, concrete differences on the ground. For example, a state can say, yes, you can move forward with this activity, but you cannot work in the stream during certain time periods because of spawning. Again, they can require minimum mainstream flows. Very concrete change on the ground through this idea of requiring conditions, or of course the ultimate authority of denying the certification. So with that, probably the most famous example, and a lot of you are probably very familiar with this, is the Dosey-Wallops River case, the PUD number 1 that I drew those Justice O'Connor quotes from, is just like the poster child of examples for the power of 401 water quality certification, in part because the case did go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the situation on the Dosey-Wallops, in summary, is that the Dosey-Wallops is in Washington State. Well, there's a lot of dams in the state itself. The Dosey-Wallops has run free, but there was a proposed dam on the river back in the 80s and 90s. It's called the Elkhorn Project. And this dam would have diverted about 75% of the river's flow out of the river and run it through a hydroelectric facility and returned it to the river about a mile downstream. So you've got a mile of river that's, pretty dramatically impacted by this diversion. 75% is a lot of the water. Because it's a hydroelectric facility, it required a FERC license, a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license. So that triggers 401. You've got your federal license or permit there. So the applicant, which was, the Jefferson County Public Utility District is what the PUD refers to, and the city of Tacoma. They were the project proponents. They had to get a 401 water quality certification from the state. The state did, in fact, issue a certification and certified the project, but with conditions. And those conditions were in-stream flow. So I think what the state said was it varied a bit, but between 100 and 200 CFS had to remain in the stream in order to protect the designated uses of the Dosey-Wallops. The Dosey-Wallops was what's called a Class AA river, very high-quality habitat for salmon migration, rearing, spawning, and harvesting. So really needed some flow in there to protect that designated use. The state did not have in-stream flow criteria, but they did have this designated use. So among other important things that came out of this Supreme Court decision was the clear statement that you can protect designated uses directly using 401 water quality certification, even where you do not have the specific criteria, say in-stream flow criteria. In this case, clearly the salmon needed the water. That was a designated use for this river, and if you did not have enough water, you were going to be harming that designated use. So there's lots of things in this decision, but it's very fundamental for what we're talking about today. So it looks like there's some good chat going on over here about this case. Melinda says, might be worth noting that after PUD, this case, the Washington legislature passed statute that limited using flow criteria in 401 certifications in FERC situations. Yes, as in everything we do, there's a cyclical nature. It's not so much nature's cycle as maybe the political cycle. All too often, if you have a policy situation, it goes through litigation. That litigation kind of establishes the new norm, and then it comes back to the political realm that tries to change what's just happened. So it is a very cyclical thing and something to be very aware of as you're using these tools for sure. But that's probably the most famous 401 example. The other one I wanted to mention at least briefly here is a more recent one from this year. And I mentioned this special use permit situation where there was a recent decision that said the Forest Service had reissued a special use permit and they had not sought 401 water quality certification from the state. And the court said, you need to do that. It was for a dam and diversion on Fay Creek. The dam the diversion would have removed 100% of the flow, had been removing 100% of the flow from Fay Creek, and this reauthorization would have allowed that to continue. And the court said, no, the Forest Service, you cannot move forward with that permit without getting 401 certification from the state. So this may in fact turn out to be really important for Fay Creek because California generally does require at least some flow in creeks to protect downstream resources, of which there's quite a few in this particular scenario. So the local watchdog group that brought this case really was able to change the nature of the discussion about this long-standing dam and diversion on the Forest Service property, and now has some hope of restoring those downstream uses, which include aquatic life. So there's an example to wrap up a little bit on 401. Again, we have a whole webinar on 401 that's been recorded and is available on our website if you're intrigued. Some things to think about in terms of strengths is, it is applicable even without in-stream flow criteria or physical criteria, the others we talked about. Can simply be applied in the case of protecting a designated use. So that's very powerful. And once 401 is triggered, there's a broad array of the type of conditions that are possible. So it doesn't have to be simply minimum flows. It could be timing. It could be all kinds of things. It could be a lot of habitat issues. And it's important to remember that the trigger does not have to be for dam or diversion. It's any federal license or permit that may result in a discharge opens the discussion about flow. So even though that flow might not be the issue originally on the table, you can bring it to the table and say, well, one of the conditions we want to see is a better flow situation in this creek, for example. Some of the weaknesses is you do need that trigger of a federal license or permit. I think that universe is larger than we've been thinking of it. The special use permit from the Forest Service case is an example. One of the things I've been talking a lot about with people is, where exactly are all these federal permits and licenses? And it's important for watershed groups to think through what kinds of activities maybe should be triggering this review, giving the state this authority. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the application to non-point source kind of problems is fundamentally a question. There's at least one court has stated that 401 certification is not triggered by a non-point source situation. So even if there's a federal permit or license for, say, for example, grazing, if that's non-point source, that does not trigger this 401 certification, this one court has held. I think that there's some healthy discussion going on in legal circles about if that is actually the case, if there should not be a lot more discussion around that question. But it's important to know as a practical matter, right now that is fundamentally in question. And of course, this is a power of the state, or in a lot of cases where state or tribes have water quality standards authority, it's the tribe's power. And you need your state or tribe to be willing to take action and use, flex that muscle and apply it in this way. We've seen that states and tribes are willing to do it, but all the normal political things come into play here, and so it's really important to have kind of a discussion and an understanding of where your state or tribe is on the use of this tool, particularly as it relates to flow. So that's it for 401. Anybody have any questions on that section? see there's a couple people typing here, so maybe I'll try to wait at least a second and see if those are questions or comments. Either they're long questions or you guys are maybe talking amongst yourselves. So I'm going to move on, but if I see some pop up here, I'll come back to them. So I want to make sure we get through this last section here, and then again we can circle back to more questions and comment as well at the end. So the last tool area that I said I would talk to you about is the Impaired Waters program under the Clean Water Act, which is often referred to as the 303D program, the Total Maximum Daily Loads program. It's basically the Clean Water Act's approach to identifying and restoring impaired waters. These are waters that are not meeting water quality standards. So it may be that they're not supporting their designated uses and or they're not meeting those water quality criteria, or in the case of anti-degradation, they're degrading. There's a downward pattern. So the basic approach under the Clean Water Act is really simple, surprisingly simple for Congress. It just gets very complicated in the implementation. So what this Section 303D talks about in terms of Tmdls is where you have a problem, you want to do three things. First, you're going to identify the waters or portions of waters not meeting water quality standards. And then you're going to prioritize those waters for restoration. And then you're going to develop what's called a total maximum daily load to restore the waters. I won't get into all the details of Tmdls in this session since it is intermediate. But for those of you who are brand new, the basic idea of Tmdls is figuring out the load that a water can take of a pollutant, particular pollutant or that's causing a problem, and divvying that up among dischargers. So you can think of it as deciding the size of the pollution pie that you can safely have this much pollution in the river before you're going to have a problem with your cold water fishery or it's going to be unsafe to swim, when you're going to violate your water quality criteria, and then figuring out how to divvy that up to make sure you never go above that amount, that load to the water. So that's a gross generalization, but Tmdls in a nutshell. So those three steps are pretty straightforward. There is, however, a long-standing debate about how to address waters that are impaired by habitat or flow alteration. So traditional pollutants, say mercury or bacteria or heavy metals other heavy metals you might see. They've been running through this three-step process, not as quickly as anybody would like and not with the success that we might hope, but that's been relatively straightforward. When it comes to flow impairments and habitat impairments, we've had a harder time fitting them into the system. And the main reason from a policy standpoint is this difference between pollution and pollutants. Raise your hand if you've heard about this kind of English teachers debate in the Clean Water Act. Give me an idea here. Okay, quite a few of you. All right. But by no means the majority, but a lot of you have heard of it at least. All right, well, I'm gonna try to explain this. This is my other really text-heavy slide, and I didn't put citations in, I realized, because it would have just made it more text-heavy. But these are from the definition section of the Act. So when we're thinking about waters impaired by flow alteration or habitat alteration, the reason pollution and pollutant is important is that there's kind of two definitions of the Act, and the use of them in Section 303D of the Act is a bit muddy. So first let's start with the definitions. Pollution, you'll see here, is any kind of human-caused alteration of the chemical, physical, biological, and they add in here radiological integrity of the water. Very broad definition, and clearly would include flow alteration. It is an alteration of the physical integrity of a system. So pollution, very broad. Pollutant ends up being a narrower definition. You've got if you think of the big circle as pollution, within that there's a circle that's pollutants, and it's a much more specific list here. It's still a pretty darn broad list. I love that it gets into things like cellar dirt. But pollutant, it has been argued, does not include flow alteration, low flow situations, or habitat alterations. Essentially with low flow, you're talking about taking something out as opposed to putting something in, is the argument, and those kinds of things are not included within this definition. So that is the difference. You can think of pollution as broader and pollutant as narrower. And when you look at how 303D is written, and I didn't want to kill everybody with looking, parsing the language in this slide, essentially it is muddy about the use of these two terms. Whether it was intentional or not, I think is an interesting and open legal debate, but here's what smarter legal minds than mine have described it as. Essentially, if you look at 303D, there are those three steps. It's quite clear that the first step, where the statute talks about identifying waters not meeting standards, would probably include flow problems. It basically says the states have to identify waters for which effluent limitations are not stringent enough to implement any water quality standard applicable to such water. So very broad. If you're not going to be able to meet those standards just using your basic effluent limitations, you've got a problem. Identify it. That's pollution. That would include it. And in fact, when they talk about the second step, prioritizing those identified waters, it specifically says pollution. It says that you should rank those waters, have a priority ranking, taking into account the severity of the pollution, using this broader term. However, when it gets to the third step of actually developing TMDLs, it talks about developing TMDLs for pollutants. And so in the legal wranglings, the wordsmithing that goes on, the word torturing that goes on, it would appear, if this was intentional on Congress's part, which I'm not convinced it was, that Congress for some reason intended us to identify waters impaired by flow alterations and prioritize them, but not do anything about them, not actually establish a TMDL. So that's kind of the legal debate as it stands right now, and US EPA has accepted that in the way they have suggested that states need to go about the 303D listing process. So I'm going to talk about that next. What US EPA has said as a result of this language kind of dance is that they still want states to identify waters impaired by pollution, flow, or habitat alteration, but that they should list them in a different way. So the 303D list of impaired waters is the official name of the waters that trigger TMDL development, also called Category 5 in this relatively new concept EPA has established of an integrated report. That's where those pollutant waters are supposed to go, but EPA says don't put your flow and habitat impaired waters in Category 4C, rather put them, in 5, rather put them in 4C. So that's the current guidance out of US EPA in terms of identifying these problems. The problems with this approach, fundamentally no TMDL is required, so no kind of restoration plan is developed. No alternative restoration is required. I have not yet found a state that has a different program that they've said, yeah, okay, maybe we won't do a TMDL, but these are impaired waters, we're going to do something about it. If your state has a program, I'd love to hear it. And usually no funding priority for restoration is provided to these 4C waters. On the flip side, Category 5 or 303D listed waters are prioritized for many funding pools. These waters don't get that. So although there's a place for them, it's not a very useful place, you could argue. And in fact, a lot of states have not used Category 4C or have only lackadaisically used it. Maybe there's a few waters in there, but they haven't consistently identified these waters and placed them in 4C, basically because it doesn't mean all that much. So what I want to talk about here for the rest of this little section is kind of given this reality, what are the different ways you could tie flow problems into the Impaired Waters Program? And of course, one way is through Category 4C, which we've just talked about. The other is 303D, the more official impaired waters listing and then TMDL development. And the way that states have done that is if there's as we talked about earlier with water quality criteria, if there's a specific parameter or pollutant that is tied to that flow problem or a violation of biocriteria, then you can go ahead and list it on the official impaired waters list, 303D or Category 5. So, for example, we talked about temperature, dissolved oxygen, nutrients, sediment. Where those are tied to flow, but there's also this pollutant hook, you can list them. The benefits of this approach is that a TMDL will sooner or later be developed. which again will kind of establish that pollution limit and an implementation kind of strategy of how to get to that limit. And I'll show you some examples where flow and in some cases habitat can be addressed directly as the target of a TMDL, or is more likely through the implementation of the TMDL. And just as a practical matter, whether or not you get your TMDL developed soon, you still are given priority in most states in many funding pots if you're on the 303D listed impaired waters list. You're going to get that priority. So if you want to do restoration, perhaps you want to lease some water rights even, just as a practical matter, you might find you're prioritized because you're on this impaired waters list. So I'm seeing some chat over here. I'll come back to some of these at the end because these are more like broader thoughts, it looks like, largely. So we'll come back to those at the end, but keep on chatting. We'll scroll through at the end. So those are the two approaches. There's the 4C, which is EPA recommended. It's designed to, take those waters. Unfortunately, it doesn't trigger at hardly any activity. Or there's the 303D angle that states have used of connecting it to a pollutant, and then having some of those benefits of being on the impaired waters list flow from that. Arguably, as a watershed advocate, you could also, you could advocate that flow impaired waters just should be listed, and I think there's a really good legal argument to make. The question is, if that's not going to trigger the development of a TMDL, what do you get? Well, you may get funding prioritization. That would be another alternate strategy under this idea. So, but what I wanted to really talk about in this section is, regardless of all this pollution versus pollutant, and if it gets put on the 303D list, and if it's tied to a parameter, outside of all that kind of wrangling, some states and watershed groups have been moving forward anyway. I just said, well, clearly we have a problem. Let's move forward through the Impaired Waters Program to try to address it. So I'm going to show you some examples here of the two approaches that, these very generic approaches, but two approaches that I've seen taken. For the first one is that flow and habitat TMDLs can be developed. You can just develop an actual TMDL for flow. Nothing is stopping anybody from doing that. We'll talk about the fact, though, that some of those TMDLs have been approved by US EPA, who retains its oversight authority. Some have not. They still exist. They're still being used by the states, even where they've not been approved, but US EPA has not always endorsed the idea of a flow TMDL. The second strategy we'll talk about is that if you, again, can relate your flow problem to some other parameter, as pollutant, you'll find that those types of TMDLs are pretty regularly developed in some states, and they end up having flow results. So as an implementation matter, you see changes, improvements, I would say, in in-stream flow, flow timing, etc. So we're going to look at examples of each of these, first starting with just directly creating a TMDL for flow. These examples come from Montana, and I know I have some Montana people on the phone, so hopefully they'll correct me if I go too far astray. But the first example here is Deep Creek, a creek in Montana that had a TMDL developed back in the mid to late 90s. And the problems on Deep Creek were varied. The problems included, the numeric targets that the TMDL attempted to address included temperature, sediment, and minimum in-stream flow requirements. There are several things going on in this stream, all kind of interrelated. And so the state developed a TMDL that, among other things, addressed, as a target, flow. They submitted it to US EPA, and US EPA approved the TMDL. And in fact, Deep Creek is something of a success story in terms of several of the parameters, but flow specifically, they were able to address flow issues using this TMDL. So that's kind of the mid to late 90s, straightforward. Got a flow problem, develop a flow TMDL and other parameters, get it to EPA, get it approved, move forward with implementation, get some flows in the stream. What complicates matters is that later, in I think it was late 2000, Montana again developed and submitted to EPA a flow TMDL, this time for Big Creek. As you can see, the pictures are a little fuzzy, but the upper left-hand corner picture, clearly there's a bit of a flow problem there, as in no flow, not a lot of happy fish in there. The difference with Big Creek compared to Deep Creek is that Big Creek was only for flow. It wasn't for other parameters, so there was not a target for sediment issues or that kind of thing. It's strictly for flow. So the state developed this, and actually even before they submitted it to US EPA, if I understand correctly, they had set up some deals to get in-stream flow back into this creek and address the impairment. So the state submitted to US EPA, and the agency refused to take action on the TMDL. They didn't deny it. They actually, to some extent complemented it, but basically said this flow is not a pollutant. This is a pollution situation. Hence, TMDLs are not required. Hence, we will not approve or disapprove this TMDL. So the TMDL stands, and you can see in the bottom hand picture there's water in the stream. The state is using it. The sad part, though, about the response from US EPA on this pollutant versus pollution thing is that Montana, like many states, is operating under a consent decree where they need to develop a certain number of TMDLs each year. And if EPA is not counting this as a TMDL, these flow TMDLs are not going to count towards what they're required to produce. So activity on these types of TMDLs in Montana has really fallen off. The state agency staff described to me that they still think it's a viable approach, and they still are addressing flow through implementation of other TMDLs, but they're not necessarily pushing forward this flow-specific TMDL idea because they've got this count that they need to meet. And more unfortunately, I think a lot of states have heard of this exchange and thinks it means they can't do flow TMDLs. What it appears to really mean is just that US EPA is not going to approve or disapprove a flow TMDL, and it won't count as a bean if they're in a bean counting situation. But there's nothing that says a state cannot develop this kind of approach. So several lessons here. One, the changing response from the US EPA, kind of interesting and I'm sure hard for states to navigate at times. But also, it might suggest that a situation like Deep Creek, where there were other parameters involved, again, makes it easier to bridge that gap between pollution and pollutants and get your TMDL in place and official. So that's the Montana example. I'm seeing some chat over here, so I'm going to just see if any of these need to be addressed right away. These are discussion ones that we'll come back to. And there's somebody on the phone line that needs to hit *6 and mute themselves because we can hear your discussion. So if whoever that is can do it.
Hey, Merritt, it's Rich.
Oh, okay.
Rich Schrader. I just see Steve Harris put in something here. Is there any case where temperature TMDL results in flow?
Yes. In fact, that's good. My next example here is not about temperature specifically, but the next group we're going to talk about is TMDLs that are not for flow, but are for flow-related parameters. And
awesome.
Temperature would clearly be one of those.
Hey, thanks so much for you're the queen of all this stuff. Thank you.
I expect a tiara next time I see you, Rich. Okay, well, my next example here is, as we kind of look forward to it, this is not about temperature, but I think you guys will see the connection that could be made here. And if not, please do break in or chat. So the next example, again, this is the second approach I mentioned at the beginning of this little examples section of, maybe you don't need to get a flow TMDL explicitly, but maybe you've got a problem with a particular pollutant or parameter that you can relate to flow, and hence in the implementation arena, get at some of these flow problems. So the middle Cuyahoga is in Ohio, clearly, very famous river. It's the river that's come a long way. It's not on fire anymore, but still has some problems, particularly related to nutrients, etc., along the whole river. The middle stretch was identified as impaired by habitat and flow alteration, excessive nutrient levels, and low dissolved oxygen. So the state agency, the Ohio EPA, identified several sources of those problems, straightforward flow modification, several dams, and kind of a regulated water system, impoundments behind those systems, and then municipal discharges, quite a few wastewater discharges in this stretch. So the violation of water quality criteria that they had was a biocriteria. So they're seeing problems with the aquatic life in the stream. And through the Tmdl process, they identified that they needed to establish a target for dissolved oxygen. That was going to be their main target. And that target was tied to the nutrient discharges and what's called CBOD, carbonaceous biological oxygen demand, coming out of wastewater treatment plants. It was also tied to the existence of these impoundments and then flow alterations on the river. So you've got these point sources that are clearly part of the equation, but fundamentally it also is about flow. So just to give you a little background on the flow situation, it's a big river clearly. Upstream of the impaired section, there's a dam and an impoundment called Lake Rockwell. It's a drinking water supply reservoir. And it was depriving flows to the river. So there was no minimum flow requirements, and often there was little to no flow coming out of Lake Rockwell down into the main river. In addition, there are two smaller dams as you move downriver from Lake Rockwell, which really exacerbated the problems, particularly in the impoundment areas behind the dams, as well as fundamentally for fish life. Just structurally, it was hard for the aquatic life to move around. So what the Tmdl found, what the state agency found, was that the river itself had greatly diminished natural assimilative capacity, resulting from these flow changes that really was going to result in more stringent limitations at the wastewater treatment plants that would otherwise be required in order to meet this water quality criteria. So I think the state agency did something very clever in the Tmdl. They laid out two possible implementation scenarios. The first scenario envisioned a mix of activities that included reducing the discharge limits at the wastewater treatment plants, but also envisioned a minimum relief of 3.5 million gallons per day from Lake Rockwell and removal or modification of the two downstream dams, Monroe and Kent dams they were called. However, the agency said if folks decided not to go that route within a specified time frame, they would instead simply reduce the wastewater treatment plant limits and a lot more dramatically than they would have under the flow kind of approach, the first scenario. In fact, some of the discharge limits for some of the parameters would be zero. There were going to be very dramatic reductions at the wastewater treatment plants that would be required. That was for CBOD and ammonia, as well as some other parameters. So the agency simply put that out there. They didn't say they were going to regulate flow. They didn't talk about pollution versus pollutant. You see here that the second scenario, or the first scenario, was the scenario that won the day in the end. So the dischargers and the local communities got together and they decided it was going to be less politically painful and less expensive to address the kind of the flow situation first than it would be to have these dramatically lower limits at the wastewater treatment plants. So one of the dams, the Kent Dam, was modified in 2004. It was historic, so they left part of it in place. And the Monroe Falls Dam, which is the one you see here, was removed altogether in 2005. And a binding minimum release agreement was created with the Lake Rockwell Dam folks to make sure that there's a minimum, coming out of that dam at all times. So it ended up being, implemented, and the minimum release from the dams was in a regulatory setting so that that's enforceable. It wasn't some kind of vague non-point source trade. These were, kind of structural agreements that were put in place by the communities to avoid the more dramatic reductions at the wastewater treatment plants. And as a result, the improvement in the river was actually really quick and very dramatic. So this dam here came out in 2005. If I understand right, that was kind of the last piece in the puzzle in terms of the minimum flows, et cetera. And by December 2009, dissolved oxygen criteria were met in the river, and the condition of the warm water aquatic life community, which is what this river supported, had already improved dramatically. And it was meeting the criteria for macroinvertebrates as well as for physical habitat. The fish were taking longer to catch up. So last time I talked to the state agency, the fish were on the way to recovery, on the way to full recovery, but not yet meeting the criteria that were in place, the index that's in place for them at the state level. So the take-home lesson here, I think, is that where flow or habitat problem can be tied to a more traditional pollutant, temperature in Steve and Rich's example, or others, sediment, et cetera, all the ones we talked about, you can have a really profound effect in terms of implementation, even if you can't get into all the legal battles about pollution versus pollutant and whether or not to establish flow TMDLs. As a practical matter, the tools are there to bring, again, these issues to the table. It's not going to work in every scenario. One thing I point out this scenario is largely, not exactly, but largely the same communities that we're going to have to foot the bill for the sewage treatment upgrades were the same communities that we're going to have to make the decisions about the flow issues. So politically, that's very different than if you had different winners and losers taking on this TMDL situation. You might see a less practical outcome as a result. But it's an example of bringing people to the table to talk about a solution that otherwise might not have ever been on the table in the first place. So strengths and weaknesses, I'm going to talk a little bit about the more traditional TMDL route and a little bit about the 4C waters idea as well. 303D, the traditional impaired waters approach, getting them listed, prioritized in the TMDL development. Strengths are, it is a huge priority for funding if you get into this world. A lot of the Clean Water Act dollars, some Farm Bill dollars, a lot of state programs are targeted here. Creative solutions can be driven by a TMDL, as is the case in the Ohio example. Even where flow is not, directly being regulated by a TMDL, it can be, the discussion can be driven by a TMDL. And related to that, just interest in avoiding a listing even could bring interested parties to the table. So even before you start down this whole road, you might be able to just, say, can't we come up with a practical way to keep this water off the impaired waters list? I haven't seen as many examples of that, but it's at least hypothetically possible. Weaknesses, we've already talked about, you need a pollutant hook, particularly in cases where there's absolutely no flow in the river. You're not going to have a dissolved oxygen problem necessarily if there's no water. You're not going to have a problem with sediment if there's no water. You might not have your designated use, but you don't have a pollutant to tie it to. So in the most dramatic impairment problem cases, this might be hard to apply. The implementation hammers may be limited, like we talked about. This doesn't provide new regulatory authority to suddenly change prior appropriations. So it is going to be limited by things like the next bullet, whatever state-based limitations you might have in your state law on in-stream flow water rights, particularly in the prior appropriation states. 4C, we've already kind of talked about the weaknesses here and the strengths. It is the place where these waters are supposed to go. There's a lot of data out there that might help your state populate this list better if they're not. These are the habitat and flow impaired waters. And you don't need a pollutant hook, You're just in because that's what this was designed for, is flow and habitat problems. However, huge weakness, nothing is actually required. You'd have to create it. And the application of this across the country is really wildly varied. Arguably, though, this is something a state could decide, or advocates within a state could decide to push for, a program to restore 4C, or flow-impaired waters. That's worth acknowledging. So with that, I think I could take a few questions. We've just got a few more minutes here, and then I'll put up a few resources that you guys can look at, and some websites that you can go to think more about these things. Oh, thank you, Ryan. Ryan just made my chat window much bigger. It's hard to look back. So feel free to break in verbally with a question. I'm going to start with one here from Brian, and it says, was it suggested that there is a federal law that can be cited to stop a nomadic or temporary water withdrawal that is negatively impacting an established or allocated water use downstream? Was I misinformed that the only recourse is a civil suit by the impacted downstream user? I did not cite to a federal law specifically that could do this. Brian, you might be referring to the Tennessee example where they used the 401 water quality certification process to condition some water withdrawal permits. So that was a very narrow application of one of these tools, but maybe follow up and tell me if there's something specific that you can jog my memory on with that one. So hold on, I'm going to go back. Here's a comment from Steve, not related to impaired waters, but Colorado has appropriated $1 million for the Water Conservation Board to acquire water rights for conversion to in-stream flows. That's outside of any kind of Clean Water Act connection. You know, you could just, it's an in-stream flow issue generally, but it's a great thing. I wish we had something like that in Utah. Chris, different Chris, says, Water Quality Standard Flow Connection 401B of the Act says that states can apply other applicable laws. Oh, that's a good one, Chris, to water quality 401 certifications. Very good. I focused on an example, Dosey Wallops, the PUD number 1, that focused on water quality standards, and that's what you'll most commonly hear about. But you can use other appropriate state laws. It's in a different piece of 401 than I did a snippet of. In our 401 water quality webinar, we talk about that specifically in some examples, but it can be very powerful. It doesn't just have to be your standards or even just Clean Water Act related stuff. If you have other water quality related laws or just laws in general that are applicable, your state can condition based on those. Or if you're a tribe, it can be tribal law. One of the examples in the 401 webinar is a tribal law situation. So that's a great point, Chris. It can be quite broad. Let me see. I'm going to do one more here and then see if there's anybody on the phone with questions. So it should be noted that the 401 certification is triggered and states have this authority, to condition using minimum in-stream flows. The workload associated with doing this to make sure the conditions are backed up is immense, and the feds are not going to sign off on a certification given to them by the states unless there is consensus. But this I would disagree with. He says, I might be wrong, but the feds don't have to take the water quality certification if they think they might get sued over it. That's actually not true. The state's authority here is pretty clear. The state, that you can challenge the conditions required under a water quality certification, but the federal government, the federal agency issuing the permit cannot just decide to not include the state's conditions. They can decide not to move forward with the permitting action, but they cannot issue a permit that does not include officially issued state conditions. Now, once that permit is issued and moves forward, it could be challenged. But the federal agency does not have the authority to pick and choose, say, among conditions. So, Martin, if that's what you were getting at, I would say that is not the case. But it is very true that the workload associated with having a defensible in-stream flow requirement could be pretty immense, as you say here, pretty intense, and may well be challenged, as was the Dosey Wallops example. Anybody else on the phone with a question here before we wrap up? Oh, I see one other question here from Steve Glazier. He says, what about NFMA? And it's the National Forestry Management Act. Is that right? I think that's right. So it's about federal lands in terms of the Forest Service lands. If it's on federal land, he says here. Again, the situation here is there has to be a license or a permit for the activity. You need that trigger. And there's this legal question out there, which at least one court has said it has been answered, about whether or not non-point source kind of activities trigger 401, even if there's a federal license or permit. So the Ninth Circuit said no, grazing situation. That grazing situation did not trigger 401 requirements, even though there was a federal license or permit. So you really have to think about those triggers as opposed to just a statute. There has to be a federal license or permit that may result in a discharge, and arguably it needs to be for point source pollution, although there is legal debate around that. Okay, so anybody on the phone with a question? We're just a little over that 90 minutes here. Okay, well, with that, maybe then I'll wrap up. I will go back through the chat here and see if there's questions I've missed and try to follow up, or people should feel free to email me. It's mfrey, F-R-E-Y, @rivernetwork.org. Or we're going to send out a follow-up email with the recording link in this paper, so you can feel free to respond to that with questions. As wrap up here, there's a few additional resources that I'd suggest you look at. The first is just a web page with some of the resources we used in the paper development and developing this webinar, so you can read the brainy legal sources of some of this stuff. The second is our Clean Water Act online course if you're newer to the clean water side of things. There's a lot of information there that might help you backfill some of the things we talked about today. And the In-Stream Flow Council is just really good if you're, especially if you're newer to the idea of the water quantity side of things. They've got a lot of resources that you could find useful. So there's some resources for you. I will say that when you're done here, you're going to get a post-webinar survey. It's really helpful if you can fill those out because we're relatively new to the webinar world. We really want to hear what worked and what didn't. We try to be interactive, but it's really hard. Give us some ideas for future topics and future ways to make these better. And again, we'll send around that follow-up paper and recording of today's webinar. So thanks so much, and I'll be in touch if I missed your question, and we'll follow up.
Thanks, Merritt.
Thanks.